Restoring the Culture is hosted by Tanya Taylor Rubenstein, story mentor, and Camille Adair, family constellation facilitator. In this podcast, these long-term friends explore how stories serve our lives. Their inquiry meanders into the realms of science, theater, health, and consciousness, moving the individual and global narratives forward as they draw upon their relationship as the laboratory for their experiments in truth. So many of us feel isolated and alone in our deepest longings. Each one of us is necessary in rediscovering the truth of our human story and listening to what is calling us forward so that we can restore the culture together.
Hi, welcome to podcast number 4. Today, Tanya and I are going to be talking about restoring grief. And to begin, I'm going to read a quote from Stephen Levine's book called Unattended Sorrow. If we listen for unattended sorrow, as we might for a cry from a crib in the next room, we can hear it calling to us to have mercy on ourselves and move it forward with a heartful examination of our lingering disappointment and distress, instead of turning our back on it. When we turn away from our sorrows, we intensify our pain and close off parts of ourselves.
I love that so much.
Yeah.
I mean, I love, and Stephen, of course, is like, Stephen Levine, just has been such a voice for a long time. When I was in New York City and I was 27, right before I came to Santa Fe, that was really the first big spiritual book I ever got, was his book, Healing into Life and Death. And at the time, it was in the middle of the AIDS crisis. And I don't remember if somebody gave me that book. And I felt young to have that book about mortality and death and dying. And it was, everything he always talks about. It's so profound. And that concept of unattended sorrow is so heartbreaking and so poetic at once to me.
And I think we all have a certain amount of unattended sorrow just living in Western culture because, we're not supported in facing our suffering and facing grief. We're sort of conditioned to bypass a lot of that and instead of going deeper into our humanity. And so, it reminds me of something David Whyte says, that when you have a big event in your life, that you're moving toward a big event like the loss of a job, a death, an illness, a divorce, like what we're facing now globally with this pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
He said we hit those walls with this tremendous velocity, and then everything kind of like has to fall apart because we have not kept up with our lives. And I think that for me, this idea of unattended sorrow is one of the ways that we're not keeping up with our lives. And so when it hits, it is such a shock to the system.
Totally. I mean, a complete shock to the system. And, and there's something too, I mean, I just noticed it in myself. I was having a conversation with my husband today because something like hits, right? And then, all the unattended sorrows of the past come out. We were talking because, every time he meets grief or things falling away because things are out of control, he goes back to when he lost his daughter, who was 11 years old from cancer. But there's this whole recycling almost. But I'm also thinking about grief and from our conversation and how projection, it's like this, the unattended sorrow, almost to me, it's like, get out of projection. It's almost like the Zen bell, isn't it? Like when it comes on fast and hard like this, it's bam, 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 let go, let go, let go, let go, let go. We were going to move to Nashville. We were talking about it 6 weeks ago. He was up for possibly a role in a New York City theater production and possibly, and his 2 films had come out, and now all those film festivals are canceled, and an artist and my own sort of the way my business was going and these things aligned. And then it's like, here it is, the Zen stick, right? And when the the Zen stick comes, then our projections or our human desires to control just come like up like a force. And to me, somehow what they're carrying or covering, I should say, maybe they're covering it are the unattended sorrows. And then the way in our day-to-day life, we're trying not to feel all of that. And we're trying to just stay on the course of these big life, paths, or so we think. But then this other force is like a tsunami in some way. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. I mean, to me, I'm feeling that on the one hand, this, we are talking about velocity and kind of even the noises you made and the crashing and the image of a tsunami and how much power there is behind that, and simultaneously how grief slows us down. And so to me, it's this sort of the juxtaposition behind the power and how grief slows us down, whether we like it or not. And I've been noticing that in myself, which is partly why we decided to talk about restoring grief today, because of what's going on in the world. And you and I are so fortunate to be, seeing clients on Zoom and to be where we are and to be relatively, safe. And yet I feel like, because I'm sensitive, like most people are, all people are naturally, really is that I get tired. I think I was telling you, like, I'm getting really worn out by like 2 p.m. I want to go crawl in bed. My rhythms are off. I've been getting up in the morning and just making myself walk at least 2.5 to 4 miles, whether it's windy or cold or whatever. I'm just really forcing that just is like a non-negotiable now for my mental and physical health. But I think I'm still really feeling this collective grief. So there's this thing that, grief is personal, but it's also collective. And it takes me to the image of, the aspen forest, how the aspen trees look like individual trees, but they're actually one organism connected by a common root system underground. And I think we've maybe used that metaphor before in the podcast, but I think when I think about collective grief, like our root systems are connected and we're feeling these things. And it's really with me for some reason today. I guess I'm really feeling.
Well, there's something too, even about, I'm noticing that I'm hitting a kind of wall energetically, and self-care is just non-negotiable. Drinking water, taking walks, taking vitamins, being really vigilant about what I'm eating, all of it. And of course, we're being called to boost our immune systems and like take care of ourselves, but it's a deeper thing. And what you said about collective grief, for me, my entire life, I'm kind of somebody who receives a lot of information about an event at the front end, which of course know this, but our listeners don't. At the very beginning of this event, I was in the hospital overnight, and never have been in my life, but several times in my life, I've had this experience of kind of, because you and I are both empaths, and I know many of our listeners are empaths, sensitives, healers, a lot of coaches, facilitators, healthcare workers, as well as artists and writers tend to be empaths, right? So we're almost like the canary in a coal mine thing. We're feeling it before it even happens. So for me, I ended up in the hospital, and I realized, because I was having the racing heart stuff and they wanted to do the EKG and all of that. But ultimately, for me, what I've realized has happened is I was feeling what's happening. It made me collapse, actually, before it even happened. And you and I, of course, talk a lot about quantum time, and that people are having different people based on our sort of nervous systems and our energetic spiritual systems. Grief is hitting us all in different levels of waves. So it's almost to me like collectively, some of us are feeling it more intensely at different times, almost like, and talking about going back to the root system of the aspens, I think we're all not only processing individual grief, but collective grief, and that this is the grief of a way of life. And even if there were toxic elements, have been many, many toxic elements in this way of life, there's no spiritual bypass away from our human meeting the feelings, and as the comfort of that way of life is stripped away. And it's that thing, even I remember years ago when I was going through a divorce, the minister who married my former husband and I, and he said something part of that really touched me related to this. He said, I know you're not just grieving the individual, you're grieving a dream. And right now, globally, we're grieving, right?
I think we're totally
Collective dream.
It's interesting when you were in the hospital, I went and I was with you for a short time in the ER, and it was it was the beginning of the lockdown time for the virus,
Right.
virus. So it was a scary time. And one thing, and I had a migraine headache. I wasn't feeling well. I had really bad allergies. It was just this, it was almost like there was this perfect storm, right?
Totally.
One thing I didn't share with you, speaking of grief, and I realized it didn't hit me for a few days after that.
Mm-hmm.
But what I realized is, I worked in that emergency department, and the room you were in, it may not have been the exact one, but it was in the same cluster, little area where I actually was with a 12-year-old boy who died.
Camille.
And so, and that was one of the most significant experiences of my life. It was too much to go into in this podcast, but just to say, I had some really difficult times working in that emergency department as a new nurse, and it was all right there with me when we were there. And to be there with you, and you and I are so close, and you were having, the sort of the scary events that you were having, and then to have it be right in that same place where I was 20 years ago at a very traumatic time with this 12-year-old boy who was at that time just a year older than my daughter. And just incredible, how the events of your life can sort of come together. And then there was the feeling of what it was like being in the hospital at that time during the COVID-19 lockdown. It was just really surreal.
It was very surreal, and it's so wild. We're sharing this now for the first time. We didn't do it with each other because it was in that same bank that my daughter almost died before she was diagnosed with asthma and had the whole breathing respiratory thing, which of course, as a mother, she's 22 and lives in Chicago, has been a big fear. And one of the few COVID patients in Santa Fe at that time was wheeled out of one of those rooms and by. And so one thing I discovered, though, as I was in the hospital alone that night, I thought, well, isn't this interesting? Because we're heading into this dark, dark time. And there was some kind of spiritual kind of thing for me. And it sounds like for you too, of like, okay, like we're having to meet our shadows again. We're circling around back towards grief. We're circling back towards some old trauma, some old fear. And then in this moment, the distress and the new thing too. And sometimes I do feel, as a story worker and tracking patterns of stories with people, that we are brought, right? It's the layers of the onion tube. We're brought back around with that story to meet it now, new in this moment. And how are we going to be even more available? How are we going to be more intimate with this grief or with this revisiting? I don't know what you do with that exactly, but like for me, there was something actually, like the day after I left the hospital, I just felt joyful in the midst of all of this. Because of course we know there is this relationship between grief and joy. When I met that grief and fear, and I was there and I was scared, and there was re-triggering, but there was this exuberance that I felt, and also a real connection, I would say, on a spiritual level or a soul level of, I've just gone through another level of being prepared to step up in service at this time.
I think what it brings up for me is what it's like for the nurses and physicians, myself included, who are not working right now at the bedside. And it's, of course, like we have this privilege of being in the profession and supporting in different ways, but not taking the same risks that our colleagues are taking. And it really makes me want to cry because it reminds me of it's such a paradox, what is the book, Waking the Tiger?
Stephen Levine.
Not Stephen Levine. I'm just having my own little midlife brain moment. But anyway, Waking the Tiger, his last name is Levine. I think
Levine. Peter Levine.
Peter Levine. Thank you.
Peter Levine. I was combining Stephen Levine from the quote with Peter Levine. Yeah.
But we got it there together. We figured it out. So anyway, there's a story in that book about these kids that are buried under some kind of like a mudslide or landslide in a bus. And what they found is that the kids who were active in digging their way out were the ones who actually fared the best in terms of long-term trauma.
Because
they worked it out. And I think
working it out in the body too, the way animals do, moving through the trauma, not just the frozen response, right?
Right. And I do think that, I think that for those of us who are not able to go help at this time, I think there's a little bit of that frustration of the freeze too. Like, I mean, I could just sit here. I guess that's what's coming up for me right now. It makes me want to cry, but just the feeling that I'm feeling about for nurses and physicians, especially because a lot of the allied staff are doing telehealth. But the people who work with the body, who have to be there, mostly nurses and physicians and support staff, like, physicians assistants, nurse practitioners, certified nursing assistants. I guess I just have a lot of grief coming up about that. And it really brings up for me this, project I've been working on for a long time that is now starting to sort of gain some momentum, which is taking a look at the systemic issues of healthcare. And one of the things I identified, because in my work, I look at splits, like everything has the right to belong in a certain order to each other in order for there to be systemic health and organizational health. And one of the things I discovered is just how nurses and physicians really are, in a way, systemically pitted against one another. And the nursing and medicine, they don't get along on Capitol Hill, and they don't get along in a lot of leadership positions. A lot of nurses and physicians get along when they're working at the bedside, but there are still these dynamics, and it just recommits me to this movement of finding ways for nurses and physicians to align. Because if we could do that, we could transform healthcare. There are almost 1 million physicians and there are 4 million nurses. And if we could come together and work together, we would be 5 million strong in this country. But we can't seem to, how are we ever going to have change if we can't bring, some collaborative peacemaking and understanding to our two tribes? That feels really, really important to me. And I've talked with actually more physicians even than nurses about this. So I feel like, speaking of restoring, I'm getting some of the story beneath the story as a nurse for where physicians and have been at with that. That's deepened my awareness and understanding and helped me grow my empathy. And I'm just really excited about bringing these two things together. So that's an interesting segue. I wasn't expecting to go there in this conversation of grief.
But don't you think too, okay, so thinking about the patriarchy that we talk about so much, and it's deep, the way that it is so deeply embedded in each one of us, regardless of gender. But in a patriarchy, there's always a hierarchy. It's not viewed as a different, valuable role. It's, the way we marginalize the feminine, and again, not about gender, the way to me, we glorify the intellect. We marginalize the deeper gut wisdom, body wisdom, hands-on soul wisdom in the moment. I mean, and where the nursing profession, the root system with the healers and the midwives and the women who have always been there for birth and for death and for the tending. And then once again, the glorification of science, of Western medicine, and not to also dishonor all the gifts of that. But when will we, it's very much like a marriage to me. and a marriage where both people aren't honored equally for their contributions, but the split again. So in terms of the shift that's happening now, how do you even see that? Supporting that and the grief for everybody when there's a split in any system, and the grief and the fallout then on the child in a family system, on the patient, on the innocents in the system that aren't even playing the dominant roles. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that's absolutely right. And I think the thing we have to be really careful about is that we don't make this too complicated. I had a retreat through the Oslo Symposia, which is now the Equa project, with just with the board members, and it was such an amazing thing. We rented a house in Albuquerque, and we cooked together, and we had talking circles, and we did some basic emotional intelligence kind of sharing exercises. And it was basic, but it literally, we all left there feeling completely rejuvenated. And there was one physician, a surgeon, who said, if I can do something like this, I think maybe I can stay in medicine. He was thinking about moving to another country and leaving medicine altogether. I mean, it had that much of an impact. And so it literally, my vision for this really is that there would be these retreats where nurses and physicians come together outside of the system, and they share with each other, and they cook together, and they talk about their families, and they talk about their experiences. And this is the kind of healing that we need. It's this human contact that we don't get in these really fast paced, these systems where nurses and physicians both end up spending oftentimes more time looking at a screen than they do at the patients, and that
Well, this is
causes,
all of our lives now.
it is, and
No matter what, this is the issue, right? I mean, there's one thing, we're all global and all, but where are we with our depth-based work, our deep facilitation, our artistry, and in the case of doctors and nurses, like you said, interfacing, being with the humans that we're serving.
Because if we don't, it causes moral distress. And if we have moral distress, that takes us back around to grief. Moral distress at its foundation is a loss. It's the grief for the loss of a way being connected to doing what we came into the profession to do. And for many, many nurses and physicians, they feel that's been taken away from them. And there's so much grief around that, and really no languaging or no ways to approach it or to come together around it. And I love, the Dalai Lama says, and many other people, Goethe and a lot of other people have said this, and I think it's really fascinating, that love is understanding and understanding is love. And to me, that's what happens in these kinds of intimate retreat settings. You start to develop an understanding. I mean, I remember this same physician said something to me one time, because he's a surgeon, and this was something I didn't realize, but surgeons actually sometimes are considered not even a physician. They're higher on the hierarchy chain. They're considered to be higher than a physician. So he said, we're put up on a pedestal, and he said, and what's extracted from us on that pedestal? Like, it's like basically the price we pay for that is so deep. And so it really is, it's this real setup. The hierarchy hurts everyone. The dehumanization hurts everyone. And I think we're all walking around in grief. This is just one lens. This is just one sector of life that is up for us right now because of the pandemic.
Totally. It's huge. It's huge. And it's, I think, also there's an awakeness, though. Part of, to me, the restoring is the gratitude, the appreciation, we have every day heroes in our midst who are willing to be here for us, and the cost of that profession, whatever role in it, like you were talking about in the beginning with the 12-year-old boy, is a lot of grief. And I've been with you and talked to you when you left hospice bedsides of many beloved patients who have died. I remember, our conversations and stories over the years. I've certainly been at my own bedsides of just people in my life who have died. But one of the things that to me is so huge too is coming back to this culture. Once again, we're set up to deal with grief and isolation, when what it's all about, and not even just like you said, yes, formal retreats, but to me, story circles, right? The way we come together, you and I, the intimacy in our friendship every day, but and that we allow ourselves to go really deep, but the conditioning isn't there in many families still, and certainly not in many cultures and many systems. But it's like, to me, this is what we need. I just always am making this with my hands, the circles, the circles, the circles, because the circles are the feminine. They're the medicine to the hierarchy. Because when we get together in circles, right, it takes us back to our egalitarian roots. It takes us back to our tribal roots, our indigenous roots. In a circle, everybody belongs. In a circle, everybody's voice, again, indigenous cultures, the talking sticks, that everyone matters. And it just feels to me that there's so much, going back to Stephen's words in the beginning of this piece, unattended sorrow, when our voices are run over, when there's no place for our voices. Like, I work with so many women, and maybe they're 40 years old, or maybe they're 50, 60, in their 70s, 80s. I've worked with elders, as you know, working with them, writing. The need to give voice to, and it's like to just say, this is my story. Does somebody see I'm here? Is somebody able to acknowledge that I existed and I mattered and I matter? And, the basic needs around being just seen and heard and valued, and how the systems in this culture are set up not to value or to make people feel unvalued, but that somehow, like the medicine of the circles we talk about all the time, the worst circles we create. And I'm just thinking about your thoughts on how people can just create that sense of circle or that sense of retreat, like in their day-to-day life, if they're feeling, far away. Like, to you, how do you create these impromptu sense of circle and community to be some of the medicine for the isolation of grief?
I think doing exactly what we're doing here. It's really like leaning in, and the words that keep coming up for me are, it's like permission based, that we give ourselves permission to have our humanity factored into the equation. So that doesn't mean that we collapse, but it does mean, one thing, compassion. When when you are met with compassion, that it's like medicine, right? I mean, I feel that with you when you and I talk, and we talk about how, yeah, today was a hard day, or I'm really struggling. It's like that kind of connection. It's the medicine for grief. It's not doing it alone. It's having an understanding that grief changes the brain. So for us actually to not have the same kinds of expectations for ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
of productivity, of linear thinking, of tasks, that it's, in a way, it's interrupting life as normal. Grief interrupts life as we know it, like
Mm-hmm.
whether we like it or not. And it actually, I think the hidden opportunity there is, it gives us a doorway into vulnerability, connection, creativity in ways that we're not used to. And it's like Stephen said, if we avoid it, we increase the pain. So I think it's being permission based about it, with ourselves, with each other, having a lot of understanding and compassion, and knowing that, grief is a process. It is something we go through, like birth and like death. It has movement, it has stages, it is circular in itself. It's not linear. So you don't go through like the Kubler-Ross stages. That was like, in that time, that was a breakthrough. And now we know that the stages of grief, they move and they're more fluid.
Absolutely. I mean, and that's my life experience, right? That's life experience. It's fluid. And that we circle back around and may meet that same grief like you did 20 years later. Like, and I remember just, I think one of the worst, or I shouldn't say worst, I should say most intense experiences of grief in my life was when my ex-husband, when my daughter was a little girl, well, he had a schizophrenic break, as you know. And and we were going through a divorce, and like I went after this phone call with him when I really knew that we were never going back. And I think about hero's journey and heroine's journey structure, right? Because in the heroine's journey, the descent, like Persephone in terms of mythic structure into the underworld. I mean, the descent is the opening to a greater life. And I remember my little daughter there with her little saggy diapers and me just like having to get up, make her a grilled cheese sandwich. But inside of myself, I was literally picking myself up off the floor after just like being hysterical and devastated and whatnot, and then picking myself up off the floor. But what I knew was that I was no longer in the world as it was before. And Joseph Campbell talks about this, and Maureen Murdoch, and anybody who studies Stephen Jenkinson, all these amazing story people, storytellers and story workers. There is a descent into the underworld that is necessary. And to me, it's a surrender to the, not even, well, to the grief and just the emotion, but the surrender to the fact that we've gone into a non-ordinary world, a non-ordinary state of consciousness, and we're not going back. Once one's on the journey, there is no going back, or there's no story, there's no transformation. And at a certain point in the journey, both the hero's journey structure, heroine's journey, when one is on the road, or in the case of heroine's journey in the underworld, there's some point where, to me, like the grief shifts and transforms, and one is simply on the journey, is sort of being even carried on the journey. And to me, I think of how, rather than avoiding the grief or numbing the grief, or the fear of the grief that doesn't really let us feel, it's actually in the feeling that we're carried across the river Styx, that we're carried to the other side, that we're carried somewhere. And then we're walking in this new world. It's a transformational process, and grief is such a part of it, but also just remembering that the joy and creativity that came out of my life after that time was some of the most profound stuff. I mean, I did all these big worldly projects, these things happened, I had a book come out, I got to be on stages all across the country, but the bigger thing was my creativity got activated and kicked into high gear right after that time that I'll always think back on in my life like, wow, I was just in a cauldron of grief.
We're just about out of time, but I'd like to just, kind of add to this. I love everything that you're saying, and it reminds me of the word orbitas, which is the Latin word for bereavement. And I actually made a short teaching documentary on grief. And the name of that documentary is Orbitas. And orbitas is where the word orb comes from. And so it is like an orb. So what that says to me is it is another world, like you said. It's also gestational, like the womb. And so when we're in grief, we're actually being held like in this orb-like container, and something's transforming, something is changing. Where something is dying, we're dying with it, and something else is going to emerge. And just to have some patience and understanding that this is a normal process. I guess that would be the way I talk about restoring grief. And I'm so grateful to be restoring it with you, because you've been one of the people in my life who's had the kind of depth and soul and compassion to meet me and my grief. And I'm so grateful for that.
It is such a blessing. It's such a blessing we have each other. And just, I love what you just said, Camille, and love for people to just, leaving our podcast today, understanding, for anyone listening, if you're feeling so overwhelmed in it, number one, what Camille said, that it's a normal process, and two, that it's a journey. And you're not, because you're feeling grief, it doesn't mean you're going to be feeling it forever. And this is where our practice of faith, or our practice, even if we can't access faith, to just keep breathing and keep walking comes in, right? Just keep breathing and walking, because it is going to shift. It is an actual process.
Like a laboring.
Nothing's wrong with you. Yeah.
And it doesn't always feel like sad. It can feel like pissed off. It can feel like blame. It can feel like a lot of different, it can feel like denial. It can feel like so many different things. And just to have patience with all that.
Totally.
Oh, right. Amen.
Love to all, and to be continued in our next one.
Thank you for joining Camille and Tanya for this episode of Restoring the Culture. If you were inspired, we would deeply appreciate it if you would leave a review on iTunes or any other platform where you heard our podcast. For more ongoing inspiration and support, please join our no-cost global Facebook community, Restoring the Culture. You can support our podcast by making a donation here. And remember, we are each restoring the culture as we restory our own lives. See you next time.